This is perhaps one of the most confronting passages in the Bible. In 1 Samuel 15, God tells King Saul to wipe out the Amalekites, every man, woman, child, and even the animals. And we ask, how could a loving God do that, especially to babies? Now, this question deserves more than just a quick answer. So may I suggest that you listen till the end for the full understanding. First, who were the Amalekites? Well, they were Esau's descendants. They were vicious predators. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, we are told that they attacked Israel from behind, specifically targeting the weak, targeting the elderly and the stragglers, right after God had delivered them from Egypt, when God's people, in fact, were at their weakest moments. God gave the Amalekites hundreds of years to change, don't forget, but instead they doubled down on their cruelty. By the time of King Saul, their culture was thoroughly corrupted, a spiritual cancer threatening the entire region through their violence. And why destroy women and children? Now, this is the heart of the issue, and here is the hard but necessary truth. You see, in the ancient world, societies weren't just individuals. They were tribal, generational units, if you like. And children that are raised in the Amalekite homes, they would grow up absorbing the parents' hate, their violence, and their view of God and God's people. Now, God wasn't condemning infants. He was preventing the next wave of indoctrinated evil warriors to come to fruition. See, we must remember that God is the creator and He's the sustainer of life. And from His eternal perspective, death, the first death, isn't the end. It is sleep. Look at John 11. Now, those children who aren't eternally lost, they will rise again in the resurrection, Acts 24:15. And those children will meet a God very different from the one their culture had taught them to hate. So God wasn't acting out of anger or revenge. He was acting as a healer, a preventer. In fact, He was protecting the children by putting them to sleep. He was performing a spiritual surgery, if you like, to prevent a greater disaster and greater devastation, and prevent the children from becoming another group of evil warriors. Then why God had to act? Well, sin is a terminal condition. Sin is not just bad behavior. It's a state of being that breaks God's life-giving design that is created to sustain life. I mean, like a doctor facing an incurable gangrene, God had to cut off what could not be healed to save what could. Let me put it this way. If you had a limb infected beyond cure, would a surgeon be cruel to amputate the limb? No. The scalpel may look harsh, but is an act of love, an act of preventing further infection. So in the same way, the Amalekites had become like a spiritual infection, threatening the entire salvation plan of God. See, God's command was not random. It was surgical, intentional, and aimed at protecting the future by keeping the lineage, God's people, open for the coming Messiah. And the Amalekites was threatening this lineage. So if you look at the bigger picture, the story of the Amalekites is not just history, it is prophetic. Amalek represents unrelenting hostility towards God's purposes. It's a threat to the existence or the coming of the Messiah. The Amalekites reappear in the story of Haman in the book of Esther. Still, They're still trying to wipe out God's people, and God had to do something. So the Amalekites' annihilation pointed to a bigger truth. There will come a day when God eradicates all evil, not because he's vengeful, but because he's making room for eternal peace. In Malachi 4, it says that the day will come when the arrogant and the evildoers will be like stubble, not tortured forever, but burned up, annihilated, consumed, gone. Well, why? Well, simply because in God's kingdom, love wins, healing reigns, and no trace of sin will ever remain. So, what can we learn from this story for today? What it means is we can trust that even God's hardest decisions are made in love. It means God is more serious about healing than we often are. It also means that we need to be just as serious about removing the Amalekites from our hearts, those things that war against God's design in us, if you like. Things like selfishness, addiction, pride, unforgiveness. As Galatians chapter 5 says, a little yeast leavens the whole batch. Left alone, sin will spread. So it has to be eliminated. So in the final thought, I would say, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that they turn from their ways and live. Ezekiel 33:11. You see, the God who commanded the end of Amalek is the same God who at the cross let the scalpel of judgment fall on himself to save us. So let us not get stuck in the hard ages of story. Let us look through it and see a God who acts decisively to heal, to protect, and to restore. That's a God I trust, and that's a God I preach. Amen.